Good morning, everyone, and welcome to day 2 of the Future of Work Summit. We're here in the Graduate Institute in Geneva. Welcome to everyone in the room and online. I need to use a microphone. Thank you. Shall I start again? Welcome to the Future of Work Summit, the second day. My name is Kitrona Suri. I'm the Executive Director of the TASK platform, which stands for Thinking Ahead on Societal Change. We're delighted to be bringing you the summit from the Geneva Graduate Institute, and our first block of sessions this morning focuses on the topic of just transitions. I'm delighted to have with me today Jan Wies, who is the Global Head of Social Impact and Human Rights at Nestlé. I have Paul Ladd, Director of UNRISD, as you say it, the UN Research Institute for Social Development, and Christina Tuzenis, a Senior Consultant at UNODC, the UN Office for on Drugs and Crime. We also have a special surprise guest for you online, Natalie Komatish, Special Advisor to the Director for Sustainability and Climate at Total Energies. Thank you so much, Natalie, for joining us. Nice to see you. I'm looking this way because my screen is there, but you see me here.
Yes, I'm sorry, I cannot join and be with you really.
We're happy to have you here. You're the biggest of all of us. And we have apologies from Chad Blackman, Senior Advisor at the Office of the Director General at the ILO, who's been called away on urgent business this morning, but he did send us a full statement for me to read out. So to kick off this panel, as we'll do with all our discussions this week, we'll bring a perspective from the International Labour Conference, and for this session, allow me to speak in the voice of Mr. Blackman and read you out his statement. He says, "Firstly, let me apologize for not being able to attend this morning, as I've been called away on an urgent matter with the ambit of the ongoing ILC this morning. However, I want to take this opportunity on behalf of the Director General and the ILO to commend you and the organizers for this very timely meeting, as it comes at a time not only during the ILC, but at a time where globally the multilateral system is treating to these issues frontally like never before." Turning to the question on the significance and stakes of the conversation on just transitions currently taking place at the ILC, I must say to you that I cannot be expressed enough how important it is. Of course, constituents are in negotiations, and as such, I wouldn't share details as to the discussions, but what I will say, however, is that the issue of just transitions is critical for the ILO and for its members. Why? There are many challenges being faced by many nations around the world, particularly those in the global south, and even more so within the group of small island developing states that affect their labor force, their development prospects, and their ability to effectively enjoy a sustainable and predictable quality of life as a result of the climate crisis. We need only to look for examples within the last 5 years where many Caribbean nations have been affected by, at minimum, Category 4 or 5 hurricanes, completely setting back and in most cases destroying entire islands and their infrastructure in under just 24 hours. Whilst one may be tempted to assume that after the hurricane had ended, that some semblance of normalcy would return, though through the reconstruction, the level of debt that has to be incurred to be able to meet the demands of said reconstruction is both prohibitive and virtually impossible unless it is done through the route of borrowing capital on the international market. Why is this so, you may ask? SIDS face a particular set of vulnerabilities, which include small economic sizes, high debt levels, and most are classified as either middle or high income, the latter emerging from the World Bank GDP per capita matrix. Thus, if most are classified within this category, they're precluded from access to necessary concessional finance arrangements, as middle or high income nations are not allowed to benefit. Thus, the call to the IFIs for this change is critical. As such, next week's meetings in Paris, where there will be significant discussions to treat to a new global financial architecture, will be critical. However, I want to go a bit further. There's also the question of who will finance the just transitions. Are countries who are on the front line expected to carry the burden alone? Are those who contribute to the cause exempt from any responsibility in financing? These are some of the critical debates taking place, and I think should provide for a good basis for discussion in this summit today. Lastly, the question of building the capacity of those who are affected most is key. The retooling of the labour force is important as the skill set needed, particularly within the ambit of climate resilience, will play a crucial role in achieving this objective. It is one of the reasons why I'm writing a book towards a climate resilient labour force in SIDS around the world. This is where the ILO can work with those in the multilateral system, where also within the reality of the world of work and the decent work agenda, there must be support given, as well as strong national and regional policies that facilitate the building of the skills needed for the future of work. This is very critical, particularly where most of the jobs in the future will be technology and in some instances, AI-based. And those in the global south will require the skill sets to effectively take part in the global labor force, thus ensuring that they can maximize all opportunities whilst ensuring that they have the capacity to treat to all challenges that may arise within the context of the climate crisis. I wish you all a very rich and productive session. And should you want to ask any follow-up questions, I can be reached via LinkedIn or Twitter. And we can post his Twitter post. Thank you. So a warm thank you to Chad Blackman for his statement shared today, which I know was written in very short notice because he anticipated speaking off the cuff at this event. So I would like to really thank him for setting the scene and for sharing his perspective on the debates and discussions that will be happening over the next 2 weeks at the International Labour Conference. We'll hope to have him at a future event. With that, let me turn to my panel here in the room. Paul, perhaps I can ask you to kick off our discussion today. You're at UNRISD, you're co-leading the Just Transitions research collaboration. And you've been looking at how just transitions are defined and being addressed in a multitude of different ways, and how you could perhaps redefine them to be more inclusive. Can you share with us some of your thinking to lay the ground for the conversation ahead? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Katrina. So yeah, my name is Paul Ladd. I'm the director of the UN Research Institute for Social Development based here in Geneva. We are an autonomous research institute established in 1963, and we don't have member states on our board. We don't get any money from the UN. So each year we raise the resources to do our research work. And we tend to sort of go to the side of asking the more difficult questions, i.e. what are the concepts, what are the politics behind them, what are the distributional issues, what are the flows of power when changes and transformation happens. Our entire research strategy is focused on reducing inequalities or helping governments, other stakeholders to reduce inequalities. And we have 4 research programs, one on transformative social policy headed by my colleague Katja Huyo here. We have one on gender justice and development, one on alternative economies for transformation, and one on environmental and climate justice. And it's in that latter program where we do a lot of work and have done for a long time on the concept of just transition. As you said, we co-lead something called the Just Transition Research Collaborative. And I did want to start off by a little bit of history and a little bit of conceptual ground laying, because I think it's important then when we talk about examples and countries and sectors about how we use the term. Now, the term was used first explicitly in the mid-1990s, but its roots go back to the 1970s in the US labor movement, where particularly around environmental aspects of occupational health were affecting workers in mining in the US. But the clear roots of it go back almost 50 years. And of course, it's become now a very common use of language, particularly in the climate negotiations and climate discussions, but actually it could potentially cover other sectors as well. And in essence, the question is how justice and equity can be brought to the transition to a low carbon world for climate, but also we'll be moving to a low carbon world in other sectors, in agriculture, in health. So they definitely come into play. The term was included in the preamble to the Paris Climate Agreement, and this week in Bonn, There's a working group being set up to talk about what the just transition means and what that working group will do. And it was in that context, I think I wanted to put, I want to focus really on intended outcomes, but also mention that the policy packages that governments and others put on the table, the sectors in which they're operational are different to different people. The term has been used for so long that it's come to mean different things to different people. And it all flows really from the intended outcomes. And let me just cover two axes of those intended outcomes. The first is, they're interrelated, but the first is ambition. Is the ambition of the just transition to merely compensate workers in industries that will lose out in the transition? And that's sort of like the basement floor definition of the just transition. Then you can move up through levels of ambition. I'll give an example. Workers in mining tend to be predominantly white men. But what about their families? What are the gender impacts within families? What are the gender impacts within communities, particularly for service providers, restaurants, other people that provide services to that industry? How will they be affected in this just transition? So there's an argument around sort of scope as well. And at the sort of top end of ambition, there are people who think that the just transition should be used to redress historical injustices. And so the just transition in South Africa and its ability or not to tackle the legacy of apartheid is a clear example there, where you've got a clear male black workforce in the fossil fuel industry. And the question will be, who will be engaged in and who will own the capital assets in the transition to solar or other renewables? So there are two important axes there. One is the scope of ambition. Are you seeking merely to keep the status quo of the ownership of assets and merely compensate workers, or are you seeking something more transformative? And the second axis is inclusion. Is it only for workers, or is it also a broader definition of inclusion? And we would tend towards something that was more ambitious and more inclusive. And then lastly, I think it is important also to consider the different types of justice that you're seeking to include. And so there's clearly the justice of outcomes that we're looking at, and we'll keep it very simple here. There's the justice of outcomes, you know, what is at the end of the transition, who has benefited positively. But there's also the justice of procedure and who is included in the discussion, the agenda setting, the multi-stakeholder dialogues on the scope and ambition of what just transitions are. The point being that governments, corporations, NGOs, researchers have to be very, very clear on what they mean when they use the term just transition, so that we're talking about the same thing. And that will be an important thing of what's been covered in Bonn. And the last point, I think it has to be said, and it's in agreement with Chad, the ability for nations to go through just transitions in whichever sectors will depend on whether there is a globally just transition at the same time. Governments particularly have committed a lot of financial support for adaptation and mitigation, which frankly has yet to be delivered. Private entities also have a responsibility because they've been active in these supply chains and in these communities for many decades as well. So there is an issue of global support and solidarity for national level transitions as well, which I think is a very key element of whether local and national just transitions are possible.
Thank you so much. A great foundation for the conversation today. I think my mic is now on. Great. Thank you, Paul. I think it's incredible to think of that scope of just transitions, because we do often fall back to the I guess, basic definition of supporting workers who are losing their jobs, but this goes much more broadly in terms of bringing that angle of justice and bringing angles of inclusion and ambition to that conversation. with that enhanced scope, Jan, allow me to come to you to bring to life what this means for an agri-food business like Nestle, how you're interpreting the term just transition in your work on the ground, and if you could share some examples of that.
Yes, with pleasure. Thank you very much for the invitation. And thank you, Paul, for highlighting the basic elements of just transition. I will try to push it a bit further and also try to be a bit pragmatic. I mean, we are a Swiss company, so you know how Swiss work, and they try to be quite concrete and pragmatic. So for us, the just transition is all about farmers. And the reason for that is because we actually buy raw materials from farmers, from 6 million farmers overall. And farmers are among the most vulnerable population on earth. So globally, you know, like there are around 1 billion farmers. Not only are they affected by climate change and risks, but also for a company like us, so the largest food and beverage company in the world, 2/3, actually 3/4 of our GHG emissions come from the sourcing of raw materials. So if you look at the total volume of 92 million tons of GHG emissions we produce every year, more than 60 million tons actually come from farming activities. So if we want actually, as a company, to transition to zero net economy or low carbon economies, if we want also to transition to what we call regenerative food systems that are needed to ensure actually the future of food, we actually need to work with farmers. It's not that we have not been working with farmers so far, because as I said, you know, we're buying from them on a daily basis, but basically thinking about what is required to make farmers more resilient to climate change and also more productive, also to help them fill what we call the gap between what is their current level of income and what is a living income benchmark. For me, as the global head of social impact and human rights in a company like Nestle, the reason why just transition is very interesting and important is because it makes the link with, I guess, what is the most important topic within companies these days is climate. And basically, it actually helps us really look at climate change, and I would say the environmental agenda overall, with this social angle, so like this people angle. So what is the impact of climate change on people, and what is the role of people and farmers in particular to help us address climate change and go to zero net by 2050? This is our ambition. So I want to give you like a very specific example. That's a project that we launched in 2020. It's called the Income Accelerator Program. It's about cocoa sourcing in West Africa. The reality in West Africa is dire. If you look at the income of farmers, they make around 3,000 Swiss francs or euros a year, and it's actually half what they should make actually to earn a living income. And so basically, of course, this is a root cause of other issues like discrimination, child labor, and others. The idea is actually to try to help farmers bridge this gap, because we need them to stay in the business of farming. We don't want them to actually move, because we need them to continue to source cocoa. We also need to motivate the new generation actually to embrace agriculture, which is very difficult because average age of farmers is more than 60 years old. And so it's not very sustainable actually for the cocoa sector in West Africa. I'm saying cocoa sector, but this reality of aging farmers and young generation not wanting actually to go into farming is a reality across the board, including here in Switzerland, Europe, in the US, and pretty much everywhere else. So that's big. I think this is one of the biggest challenges that we have to face in our sector. The idea of the program is interesting, and I don't want to go into the details, but the idea is actually to use cash transfers. So this is something that the UN, World Bank have used actually for quite a long time, but not that much the private sector. And the idea is actually to, in addition to paying farmers for the quality and the quantity of cocoa we buy from them, so the typical business commercial relationship we have with them, is also to reward them for the services they provide to the environment and to communities. And this is a bit of a revolution for, at least for Nestle. It's not something that you would expect traditionally from a company like us, but this is really like for us a way to incentivize changes of behavior that we think are necessary from farmers and farming communities to become more resilient, but also to become more productive and bridge this gap with a living income. So the idea is that, we have defined 4 key elements together with farmers. As part of the pilot phase, we have defined 4 key drivers that we think will help them become more resilient and also will help us as a company. So it's not a philanthropic program, will help us deliver on our commitment, climate commitments. The first of this incentive is around good agricultural practices. So I don't want to be too technical here, but we know that pruning, for example, so cutting branches on trees, is quite vital for cocoa trees to become more productive. And it's typically not something that is being done by farmers because the belief is that the bigger the tree, the higher the volumes. And it's just wrong, actually. If you actually cut branches, if you prune trees, they become much more productive. And you can actually, based on our own tests with farmers, you can double or triple productivity just by pruning trees. The second incentive, and also like using less fertilizers and less pesticides, and that's become interesting also from a GHG emission perspective. The second incentive is about agroforestry, so using shade trees that also like contributes to more biodiversity on cocoa fields, cocoa farms. And the last 2 incentives are more related to social impacts around access to education and income diversification. But really what is innovative here is that we are willing as a company to pay actually farmers for these activities that are not related to cocoa quality or quantity only, but really also contribute to improving the situation on the ground from an environmental and social perspective. This is a model that we are now taking at scale in Côte d'Ivoire with 10,000 farmers. But this is also a model that we want to use on coffee, palm oil, and other key commodities that we have. And this is our contribution to this just transition agenda.
Thank you so much, Jan. I think it's incredible how you're not only going down your supply chain, so beyond your direct employees and operations, but also beyond your direct activities, and branching out that definition and that support that can be led by an organization by Nestlé. So interested to hear people have questions for you later on that as well. I'd like to bring us back to perhaps a more traditional definition of just transitions with Natalie on the line. Natalie, if we bring her up, I'm not sure what you see on the screen there. There she is. Hi, Natalie. I would love to come to you at Total Energies, a company really at the forefront of this traditional energy transition. To share with us a little around how you're approaching the concept of just transitions within Total. And like Jan, perhaps you could share an example to bring this to life for us.
Okay, thank you, Kitrona. So again, sorry that I cannot be physically with you because I know from far it's not the same discussion. I cannot see the room, and I would love to see also the panelists and to share more. So I hope there will be many other next occasions where I can be with you and share more. So thank you very much, Kitrona, for inviting me. For those who used to know me, including Jan, so I was the head of human rights, the director for human rights at Total between 2018 and 2021. And this has a link with the current panel, because in fact, that's how Paul mentioned the history of this notion of just transition. But at Total, it started much later. And it was in fact brought by the human rights team a few years ago as part of our human rights roadmap. So that's how it's really started. It was brought in the company. In fact, there were big debates about what it means. And I don't know if there are other companies except Nestlé, but I think, Jan, you will agree. Sometimes in companies, if you want people to move, you need to make sure they understand the concept. And Total Energy is an engineer company, mainly as a culture. So at the beginning, if you don't understand properly the notion, they would tend to refrain to engage, which was in fact our recommendation, to engage whatever the differences in understanding what just transition could mean, to start, as Jan described, very pragmatical approach. And from Paul just presented, I understand that what I will mention today, being short and being ready to answer questions later on, is just a little part of the huge challenge of what just transition can mean. Before I go further, just for people in the room, Total Energies is the new name of Total. So we used to be Total, and in May 2021, we became Total Energies, in fact, to reflect the energy transitions, which is based on achieving carbon neutrality by 2050. So this is the main strategy. And so in terms of, I will, as Jan did, I will share an example of what we do in practice, what it means for us at Total, in a very modest way, because my personal understanding is that there are so many meanings, but in fact, we are interested to hearing from others, either good practices or recommendation to go further. So what I will describe today is for sure not the end of the story. It's just one step in a very demanding journey, in my view. So first, I will, before sharing the example, which is about how we transform oil refinery, which is based in France, into now zero oil complex. So it's based in Grandpuits, which is not far from Paris. And I will give more information about what we are doing on this site and how we achieved what we consider a just transition, because we involved shareholders and a huge dialogue with shareholders. So first, to make it clear, at Total, just transition is understood as based on respect for human rights. And the commitments we took long ago already, because it started, human rights journey at Total started 2003 years ago, when we committed to respect the UN Universal Declaration for Human Rights. And of course, it was reinforced in 2011, when the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights were adopted, and Total committed immediately to them. And since then, we have put in place some governance and actions and implementation to make sure we always progress in respect of human rights. As I mentioned already, the thematic of just transition and what we need to do at Total came through the human rights lens and the human rights department. And then it was deployed, which I see as a good sign. It was taken on board by the human resources teams at Total and really developed within the social dialogue and the dialogue in particular with unions, which is already illustrating one thing you all mentioned before I started to talk, which is of course understanding just transition at Total is understood as a strong understanding is working together with our employees, with the trade unions. So meaning the first impacted stakeholders. But you will see in the example regarding the refinery that we enlarge this dialogue to include, Paul, what you mentioned, taking into account that around us, and not only for our employees, we need to work with the local business communities that are impacted by this transition. So in the example of the refinery, we did this working with different suppliers that were really next to the refinery. And these suppliers include the restaurants, the shops that were providing services for the refinery. What a key element I want to add is that we understand that, and we were introduced to the concept of just transition, in fact, by outside stakeholders. And we believe it's absolutely key to be in multi-stakeholders initiatives. So the thematic came through, and I want to thank them. I'm not sure they are in the room or listening, but to really thank the Institute for Human Rights and Business, which is the main think tank on human rights and business, because they were the ones to really bring us to roundtables to think further. We were involved, or we are still involved in the UN Global Compact platform on distant work in supply chains, where also we heard about good practices in this field, and of course the ILO. But in my view, and Kietrona, you know, I think this very strongly, I believe this very strongly, is that respect for human rights is not enough to ensure a just transition. We need to go further, and we need to go and collectively, and I fully agree with Paul that we need to address tackling inequalities. We also believe that if we do not address and tackle inequalities, we will not achieve just transition, because we will not make the energy transition socially acceptable and accepted. And as you can hear from my accent, I'm French, and from the yellow gilets, we know that it's not enough to want to make an energy transition. If we don't tackle the social aspect of it, we will not get the support we need. And I'm conscious of time, so I will probably not develop really the example of the refinery, but just to mention that Total is part of a multi-stakeholders initiative that is supported by BSR and also by the B team, which is called Energy for Just Transition. But we'll issue a report of best practice that we identified together by the end of 2024. So this is probably to be kept in mind, and we will be more than happy to share the results. And Kietrona, you tell me about the time, but I will mention the 4 elements of this refinery. So it was do I still have 1 minute or 2?
Yes, absolutely, please.
Okay, thank you. Just to mention it, and then, of course, I think it's key to answer questions, because I'm conscious, as Jan did, you also went very quickly, Jan, about what is so interesting. And we would need more time to share the real, what it means in practice. So in practice, Total took this refinery and oil refinery, put an objective to have zero oil, to transform it in a zero oil complex. So now you have 4 projects. They are not all in place. So some are in the process. So one is a plastic recycling unit. The second one is about producing bioplastic based on corn mainly. Sorry for my accent, but starch, I think, corn starch. Then the third project is about producing sustainable aviation fuel based on wastes, and mainly fat wastes, being either vegetable and animals, and no palm oil, but just collecting around the refinery enough fat wastes to produce these sustainable aviation fuels. And then 2 solar farms or 2 solar plants or areas on the refinery. And what in my view is very interesting is that all this, so this was the goal, a strategic technological goal by Total, based on the fact, to be very practical, that the refinery and the pipeline was only at 70% of its capacity. So as Jan described, there is always, I think, an incentive, a business incentive as well to start a process. But then it was decided to really engage with stakeholders. And we believe at Total that if we don't have a very strong engagement with stakeholders on just transition, we will not succeed. So in France, you have laws which are very strong to oblige you to a type of social dialogue. But what I think is really interesting in this example is that we went beyond the legal obligations, and we understood that we needed to discuss not only with the workers and the unions in a calendar which is imposed by the law, and the ILO is not with us today, or at least not at the panel, but I'm a strong believer that the states have to deliver on what they request from business, so that we have no choice. So I know it's not a usual dialogue, but after being a head of human rights, I strongly believe that the states have to really do their work on protecting human rights and not only protecting the social dialogue. So this was obligations. But then we understood that we needed to hear the people living around the refinery, as well as the local politicians, and to organize this dialogue through the local town halls. And then one of the interesting results is that as a result of this consultation, we heard we needed to add a new part of the project, and these were the solar energy part of it. Perhaps I will stop because I'm conscious of time and I'm a bit afraid of taking too much time, and I can share much more. And just to finish on the challenge, because it would be not fair and not to say that everything is so perfect and so easy. It is not, it's very challenging. And among the challenges we had at the beginning were strong strikes, because probably the dialogue was not there, it should be. But finally, so we had 45 days of strikes on strategic assets, which are the refineries. But then we reorganized the dialogue and it worked well. And I can mention that there were 400 employees in the BORF refinery. And now you have only 250, but we managed to have no layouts. So some people moved within Total in other different sites. Part of them decided to leave with packages. So again, Paul, it's probably showing that Total is ready to pay for part of this transition. We are investing about 500 million euros on this new projects. And then we invested, and we are still investing on a training center to help people who had specialties which were on oil to come to these new renewables specialties.
Thank you so much, Nathalie. I think it's really important and really helpful to bring to life what it means on the ground for a company like yours that is shifting its production from one means to another, and the huge challenges and effort that entails. Christina, I think Nathalie provided a nice jumping off point for you there, around both from your current work at UNODC, but also in your previous role with the International Organization for Migration. You work a lot in the governance space and also in the addressing risk space. And I think in this transition, there are many risks that are not in the headlines, that are perhaps unseen in the mainstream conversation that we have on just transitions. So I'd love you to bring those to light for us a little. Thank you.
Thank you so much for giving me such an easy task. First of all, let me just specify that I am a consultant for UNODC, so I do not speak on behalf of the office. I am not in any way or form expressing the opinions or the policy or the guidance of the office. I'm here in my own capacity because, as Katrina said, I've been working in this space for enough years to earn some gray hairs and some wrinkles. I think that, first of all the speakers have given me very good points to sort of try to round off the conversation before we start the discussion. One of the things I've really seen over the years is that the challenges in unpacking what justice actually looks like, and demolishing some of the myths around both social justice and human rights. What does this actually mean? I've worked in spaces where you constantly encounter resistance towards the implementation and the respect of human rights for the people that I have tried to represent. So basically, mostly non-nationals, migrant workers, people who have been trafficked, and to a certain extent, people with international protection needs. And I think that's something that in this entire discussion is really important to understand. What does effective implementation of human rights actually mean? And how can we link that to respect for the environment? Because when we focus very much on the environmental transition, we need to link that to understand that, well, people live in this environment, and people who live in abject poverty will not have the energy to think about, am I recycling? Is the energy that I'm using good for the environment or not? as well as a lot of the initiatives that we have, not necessarily only in countries such as Europe and the US, but all around the world. Do they have a negative impact on the societies in which we live? It's very good to say we want to have clean water, we want to install plants that clean the water from our factories, but if we then displace populations or displace communities, we actually end up having a negative effect also. So having that more rounded understanding of the impact of what we have, I think is really important. And what all the speakers also mentioned is that it's necessary to have this multi-stakeholder approach, but also think about who are our stakeholders and do they actually have a voice? Because it's fine to include your shareholders, it's good to include the government, but sometimes those who are actually most impacted are those who have no voice. And unless we understand who they are and whether or not they have actual representation, then we are not living up to one of the basic human rights principles, which is participation. And that also brings me to some of the points around who have the responsibilities, because when we speak about human rights, the duty bearers are states, right? So it is up to states to enact legislation that then makes it impossible, basically, well, hopefully, for anybody to violate the rights of others. And I think sometimes when we talk about the bigger issues and the violation of social rights, for instance, and the responsibility of companies, we forget that new legislation is necessary, and it's not putting a new obligation that comes from, I don't know, somebody who got a big idea one day. This is something that we've seen in other areas of law for a very long time, such as I'm not allowed to just go and hit Katrina on the nose right now, right? Because that would be physical assault. And exactly. And the police would probably come and say, why did you do that? And we need to have a very good reason. So there is, I mean, the rule of law exists. And the fact that we are now also looking at how do we regulate the behavior of big companies and what do they actually, and small companies, and what impact do they have, not only in the environment, but on societies, is a new concept in terms of who the focus is on, but it's not something that is new. The state has an obligation to do so. So having that multi-stakeholder approach, understanding who has responsibilities when and why, I think is something that we need to probably unpack for a lot of people so that it doesn't seem as if this is threatening, and really understand how the respect for human rights, which is how I see social justice, because that's sort of my professional deformation, is something that really can benefit everybody. And some of us in the room, and I'm among them, are old enough to remember when we talked about the Leave No One Behind agenda and focusing on those who are most disadvantaged, to bring them up to a level of participation, of having choices. And that comes into my experience also in the migration and the trafficking and exploitation sectors, where you can see that, for instance, climate change, environmental degradation is a cause of migration, is a cause of people moving, but it is also something that when we don't respect the rights of people, they are not able to actually make choices that are good for the communities as well as for the environment that they live in. I think it's also really important what a lot of the speakers said, that this is not only about workers' rights. It's not only about how do we respect people who are either working directly for us or in supply chains, but how does that then influence communities? And really see that not as an onerous thing, but as a positive impact. Because if you respect workers' rights, it will have a trickle-out effect. Somebody who earns a living is more able to send their kids to school. Somebody who has, let's say, either health insurance or something that protects their health in their work environment will be better able to continue to make a living, will be better able to provide for his or her family and give further opportunities to their kids. So things will have this positive trickle out. And I think that sometimes the advantages really of protecting rights and how everything is connected is not necessarily communicated, and that's our fault sometimes, that, you know, we don't really manage to show all the positives. So child labor, for instance, is a great example. I mean, it's horrible, but there is a tendency to just, you know, balk and say, oh, child labor is horrible, we can't have children working in our supply chain. Absolutely true, but child labor doesn't exist in a vacuum. It's not a question of either these children are exploited or everything is hunky-dory and they go out and play and go to school. If children work and if children are exploited, it is because the community around them is not having the possibilities to give other options to these children very often. And it's because parents feel they have no other options than to sell their children or have them out in the working forces. So it's important to see those dots and see, okay, but if we actually pay a living wages to parents, well, then we can, to a certain extent, address this and look at the more communal and societal forces that push people into exploitation. So I'm getting many signs that I need to shut up, but I think it's okay. But I think we do really need to think about how things are connected and show that quite a bit more than we currently do, and demystify some of the things that can be done. You know, some things are, well, societies and human beings and interconnectedness is complex. I think that's important that we recognize that without saying, but this is too complicated to do anything about, because that's a huge difference, right? And say, there are many societies and communities around the world where before we reach a level of well-being, which people sitting here would consider okay, there are many steps to be taken, but we need to take those steps instead of just be, okay, we can't do anything about that because I don't know where to start. I think that a lot of people who are not necessarily in this space for a long time and do not have the wrinkles on the gray hairs we have because we've been in the space for a long time can be a little bit intimidated by where to start. And I think it's important to demystify it.
Thank you so much. There is a lot in that discussion. We've taken the journey from multiple angles. I think broadened my perspective certainly on what we mean by just transitions. We have around 10 minutes to open the floor to all of you for any questions. Yes, we have a. Thanks, Ishta.
Okay, thank you. Hello. First of all, thank you so much for insightful conversation, and I was very involved and able to feel a lot of motivation and passion towards for it. I'm a student at the Geneva Graduate Institute, and I'm very much interested in the intersection of health and environment, but also everything is also related to human rights. I would like to ask, how can we increase the engagement of various stakeholders, as you mentioned, especially vulnerable groups who receive the impacts of climate change and transition to a low carbon industry? Thank you.
Great. Any other questions around the room at the same time? There we go.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you for the interesting discussion. I have a question to Jan on this interesting example from Nestle. First of all, I was wondering, you know, you said, of course, there's so many farmers where you source your food products from. And my question is, you know, how is this project of the cash transfers conceived in a way? It's a small amount of people. So is it a pilot? Are you thinking of maybe afterwards transferring it to government? Are you also in conversation with the government? You know, how does it fit into this very complex problem that you described of, you know, farmers actually not being able to get stable livelihoods, which impacts on their farming activities and also on the relationships with the community, but also, of course, the environmental impacts?
Sorry, one more at the back, and then we'll hand back to the panelists.
Thank you very much. It's Shireen Lindsay-Hurst from Media 21, Geneva. I would like to ask, has the move from corporate social responsibility to human rights liberated the possibility to participate in the discussion now for human rights? I do remember previously it was always corporate social rights, and there was a fear in the corporate sector to actually address the term human rights. Thank you.
Wonderful, thank you. Who would like to address any of those? Turning back to our panel, we've got around, yeah, Jan, can go.
Yeah, I'm happy to start quickly. I can talk to the three questions very quickly, but how to include stakeholders? Just going back to my example of this income accelerator program, we co-designed the program with farmers. And that's very important because to define the incentives that also like matter to them. And also just a few examples of like how we actually strengthen the program. So the cash payments are now made actually when it matters most for farmers. So either like before the school periods or after harvest, but when actually these periods during the year, when they need more cash actually to basically like pay whatever they need to pay. And the second adjustment that we made to the program is actually to split the cash incentives between male farmers and female farmers. Also to recognize the work that women are doing on the farm, which is often very invisible. The scope of the program, we started with 1,000 farmers in 2020. We're now at 10,000 farmers. The commitment is actually to bring it to all our cocoa farmers globally, so 160,000 families by 2030. And we also now starting with coffee. Coffee is much bigger for us as a commodity, as a raw material. So this is our way actually to bring it at scale. So not only at the pilot, we started with a pilot, of course, always, but we know that we will have to really tailor this program to the new countries that we want to bring it. So for example, Brazil is very different from Ivory Coast or from Ghana. So we will need to adapt to the program to the context where we operate. And human rights, yes, it's all over the place actually. So we have moved on a lot from the time where companies were hesitant or feared actually to engage in that space. There are people like me in companies like Nestle actually trying to really like move the agenda. And it's absolutely essential because I think it's the human rights agenda is interesting because it really helps put people at the center of like how companies think. Either like from a pure business perspective or from an environmental perspective, climate change, packaging, like all our big priorities, sustainability priorities at Nestle, so climate change, packaging, water. The human rights agenda helps us with decisions. We actually make sure that these decisions will not have a negative impact on people, or when it's the case, actually to mitigate that impact. So that's quite interesting for companies, I believe.
Yeah, full disclosure, I know both Jan and Natalie from my time at the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, working on the human rights program there. And when we started, it was almost like an Alcoholics Anonymous. I'm a multinational corporation and I have human rights issues. Do you have some too? But it's come so far in the last few years, I think, really thanks to the UN guiding principles for business and human rights, and thanks to people like Jan and Natalie who speak openly about this subject and drive the agenda to make people comfortable within their organizations. But Natalie, I'd love to hear, I know it's hard to jump in online. I'd love to hear your responses to that question in particular, but also the others.
Of course, on this one, and I will be interested to hear Christina as well on the question, which was how we can involve more the vulnerable groups. I will answer on the part. So of course, as Jan said, and Kitrona just now, and thank you so much. Here you have two examples of companies who are not fearing to address human rights, and not only not fearing, I think we consider it's key. I will not talk on behalf of Nestle and Jan, but Total Energy, and we know that there are in fact many companies like this, not enough, but who are not afraid and already for a long time. And that's for sure. But as Kitrona just said, I fully agree. The UN guiding principles on business and human rights, that really helped, and why? Because if you read them, it's about 30 principles, 31, and they're easy to read. And then 4 years later, you had the reporting framework, which was issued to help companies to implement. So it was not only about talking. And me, I come from the real business units at Total Energy. I've been in this type of companies for 30 years. And I know that we need to bring the wording that is understood by the business units for them to implement. And that's what this type of standards are giving, to put it in practice, to be pragmatic, as Jan mentioned, because I think it's key. And then I will just give a bit of my analysis about how to involve more vulnerable groups. And then Christina, I'm really interested to hear you on that, because I think it's really key. We know it's not easy. And in many countries, because I shared an example, which is in France, and it's not by chance. It's because in France, we have a long history of social fights, in fact, of social dialogue, which I think is very important. I love this history. We need it. So it gives strong rights to workers. And the example we have in France, which I could not develop too long today, but I could. Of course, my view is that we could take this type of example to bring this type of quality dialogue in other countries. But you are right, Christina, in my view, it's always a challenge to identify the vulnerable groups, to be sure we are not forgetting ones, because they are easy to be forgotten, because some of them are not used to be organized, and they are a bit feared and impressed to approach big companies. And so one answer, and I will stop there, is to be helped by others, and in particular by NGOs. And I will mention not only NGOs, but for example, the International Federation for Human Rights. When they go and they have the networks in some countries, they identify groups which are fear to approach us because they don't know how to approach us, but they know them. So in some countries, this type of organization, in fact, they are helping us to access and to bring the voices. And I will also mention the representative of the UN Office of the High Commissioner on Human Rights. When they exist, that's where they are key, because usually they are trusted by some vulnerable groups. And if they accept to organize roundtables and to bring to the table people who are not accepting to talk to us, it could be probably a way of making sure we are involving as well vulnerable groups. But I don't know, Christina, if you agree of what you could advise.
Well, thank you for giving my answer, basically. I think that there's no doubt that, when we start out on these things, there are people that will not necessarily be included because we don't have the contacts. We might have an idea who they are, but we can't reach them exactly as Natalie says, either because there's a fear, because they're not organized. And, we cannot necessarily speak to 500 people who each have a concern. So the system is set up in a way everywhere that, you need to have representation to some extent. But exactly as Natalie says, there will be people on the ground who are already working with these groups. Some will be organized. And then as you develop your experience, you will also learn to spot when somebody might not actually be truly represented, because sometimes, the ones who shout the loudest are the ones who will be listened to. But that's something that comes with experience. And I think I come back to the point before, is that we need to be able and have the courage to take those first steps that where we might make mistakes, because otherwise we're never going to make any move forward. And as Natalie says, there's also a lot of UN agencies that are on the ground who actually have those contacts and who can facilitate, which perhaps right now, for instance, with UN country teams and with specific agencies is not necessarily being used enough. So the first step for that multi-stakeholder engagement is to have let's say the organizations and the organized entities actually say, okay, so who do I know and who should I bring in? I can just say, I can give an example that's outside this scope. I just worked with an international NGO on how to make certain, and those are big words, that people living with disabilities are included in humanitarian responses. And humanitarian NGOs and people living with disabilities are not necessarily at all in touch. And one of the things that we really said is that we need to have those two sectors work together from a development perspective before a humanitarian crisis actually hits, because then the collaboration is automatically there, because otherwise in evacuations, in camp responses and what have you, people living with disabilities are very often the ones left behind. So again, there it was, okay, we don't really know who are our counterparties in regions, in countries. So that was something that we were then facilitating, that's a process that's starting. So that's a parallel example, and it's a process.
Thank you so much. I take the organizer's prerogative to add a couple of minutes to our agenda, ask your ongoing engagement before we stop for a break between our breakout sessions, to give Paul a last word and reflection on these topics.
I think, yeah, just 2 points. There's clearly a strong human rights rationale for defining the parameters of your multi-stakeholder engagement quite broadly. But I also think there's actually an industry case as well. So let me try to make it. I mean, if Jan, as you mentioned, you know, young farmers around the world are dropping out of the industry. And I think if you want to actually understand the incentives of farmers, you actually also have to talk to their partners, their wives, their husbands, their children, the people that they work with, the migrant laborers, the people on informal contracts at the sort of the edges of the supply chain, at least the communities as well, to actually understand what the incentives in that whole industry are, why children might be engaged in picking cocoa, for example. And therefore, I think actually you learn quite a lot from a little bit of research and talking to people, and then that can allow you to guide your support that you'll be giving them. Secondly, and you know, we're a research institute in the UN. We actually do a lot of work on helping to contextualize with thresholds the plethora of quite ineffective ESG standards that there are at the moment. But one thing I would say from some of the people that we engage with more on the campaigning side is that there is a restorative justice element to this, which often gets downplayed. And so not wishing to be critical of businesses that are actually going out there and doing something, but some would say it's a bit too little and it's a bit too late. So, you know, the schemes that are being piloted, if you look at the retrospective profits that have come from extraction and quite often human rights abuses, these schemes are quite small. So I guess there's a lot of community out there that is calling for more ambition. They're calling for a more ambitious scope. They're calling for more inclusion. They're calling for a truer respect of human rights in the processes. And you're at the beginning of a journey, but you'll hopefully get there.
Thank you so much. So we've heard of an increase not only in the scope of the definition of just transitions, but the depth, the voice and engagement, and even the temporality of how we look at those transitions, but always such a tangible and actionable lens that I feel like I have a better understanding and more hope going forward for the task at hand. I hope you've all enjoyed the conversation too. Natalie, did you have a final point just to say?
Just a comment, because of course we would love to discuss more, and Paul, I of course take on board what you have just said and heard it. Just so what I wanted to say is beginning of a journey, yes, for sure. We all understand that it's what I described, for example, today, or what we are doing. It's just the beginning of a journey. But I don't agree that it's too late, or a bit too late. You mentioned a bit too late. I think it's never too late, but I'm hearing what you are bringing, which is going further, more ambitious. And I hope that's what my company is trying to do, listening to what is expected from us and reacting, sometimes, always further. So I hope it's not too late in the sense of, as a citizen of the world, already not as an employee at Total Energy, it's not too late. That's a message of hope.
Thank you so much. We are going into a break for 30 minutes, and then please stay with us here and online for our series of breakout sessions, which will be hosted by our colleagues at the World Economic Forum on just transitions, what next for trade policy. We'll be looking at doing good by going green with colleagues at PwC and the ILO. And we'll be looking at regenerative sustainability and the lens of future generations with the SDG Lab. So stay tuned for that. And thank you for joining us. A huge thank you to all our panelists for your enthusiasm and honesty.